for sharing. And a lot of what you said are the reasons I'm running for this seat. You know, I think we see and feel, we physically see the income inequality. We see the homelessness, right? We see people getting, you know, losing their homes or can't afford their rent. They get gouged. We see the challenges in our education system. And so a lot of those reasons are the reasons I'm running for this seat. So let me tell you a little bit about my background and who I am. I'll probably touch on a lot of what y'all said, but if I don't hit everything, I'm happy to stay as long as you'll have me and answer as many questions as y'all have. But also I don't have all the answers. And I'm someone who's running for office who's willing to admit that. But I like to keep myself surrounded by smart people. The other thing is that this is like my 176th or 7th or something house party this campaign. And so I learn a lot from these. And to me, that's what our democracy is about. And I think we need more candidates, more elected officials literally being in people's living rooms, having conversations about the issues that people care about. And you'll notice, you know, on my website, I've got a bunch of policy platforms outlined. A lot of that is driven by thinking that I've had at these house parties because I want to go and represent you. And the only way I can represent you is if we're sitting down talking to each other eye to eye, having a conversation about the issues that we have. And so I've gotten a lot of ideas from these house parties, so please feel free to offer ideas as well. So me, I am born and raised in the great state of California. I grew up in a tiny little town called Forest Hill in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Has anyone heard of it?
Yes, of course.
Well, why of course? How of course?
Fourth generation.
Yeah. So have you been there? No. I mean, no one's been there. It's tiny. Well, it's basically
tiny on the ridge and the thing.
Yeah, so you go up to Auburn, up to I-80, like you're going to Lake Tahoe. Then you go over the big bridge. Exactly. Yes. Yes, and then you basically you sort of get off in Auburn. Yes, I know you've definitely been there. God bless. You drive off into Trump's America. That's basically where I grew up. It's very politically conservative there. You know, I grew up in a trailer, a very humble upbringing, and my town is a town of like 1,500 people, no stoplight. It's got like, you know, 1 school, 3 bars, and 4 churches, and that's basically the town. You know, you've been there. It was an old gold mining community that then turned into a logging community, and then when the mill shut down in the 80s, it just kind of became economically depressed. And it over the course of time, I mean, I witnessed it myself, we started to see all those problems you see in rural, impoverished communities, you know, drug addiction, teen pregnancy, a lot of these challenges, right? And my 8th grade class was 71 people, and I think 6 of us made it through college. So not a high completion rate there. But, you know, I had great parents. My dad worked, still have great parents. My dad worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 35 years fighting wildfires, which at the age of 73, he gets called out of retirement to go fight wildfires. He's in a wildfire right now up north near Shasta County that he's been on for the last like 2 or 3 weeks. My mom was a stay-at-home mom until when my brother and I were little kids, she decided she wanted to be the first person in her family to get her college degree. So she went to our local community college, transferred to Sac State. Took about 8 years. It's not the 4-year live in the dorms plan when you have 2 little kids, you know. She got her degree. And my brother and I went to that same community college. We couldn't afford a 4-year university out of the gate. And so I'm a big supporter of community colleges. I remember when I was at a meeting in the White House, we were talking with some colleagues about where we went to school. And one of my colleagues said to me, he said, "Oh, well, my dad went to Harvard, so I went to Harvard." And I was like, "Oh, my mom went to the local community college, so that's where I went." That was like the Wicks family legacy school. Like $9 a credit unit is what we could afford in my house, right? So I'm a big supporter of community colleges, and I know that my path of growing up in a trailer and working in the White House was made possible because of educational opportunities that we had. You know, and the California community college system, right? And I think everyone should have those opportunities. And I'm going to talk about education a little bit more in a second. So after college, I moved to San Francisco, moved to the Bay Area. And I was an organizer in the anti-war movement. And I was the girl with a bullhorn and a nose ring and a lip ring and multicolored hair, and I was the San Francisco organizer, organizing all the large protests and demonstrations that were going on at the time, right? And I was stage managing all these big events with Joan Baez and Danny Glover, and you know, I'm sure you all remember those events. And I was shutting down the Bechtel Corporation the day the war had started. But it was around this time that I actually had a pretty seminal experience happen to me that really changed the trajectory of my career. I was driving to work and I got a call from my roommate at the time and very good friend, and he said, I just tested positive with HIV, and can you pick me up from the clinic? So I drove to the clinic in the Mission District, and I sat down with him and the nurse, and I learned about T-cell counts and viral loads and things that I frankly didn't know that much about. And when we got into my car, he turned to me and he said, I don't have any health insurance. And this was the week that we started dropping bombs in Iraq. And it really crystallized for me how messed up our priorities were. You know, here we were going lockstep into this war that I felt was unjustified, and we were about to spend billions and billions of dollars on a war that I thought was completely unjustified. And yet we couldn't even provide basic health care to our people. We're one of the wealthiest nations in the world, right? So I got mad, and I decided that I wanted a seat at the table when our country was making these decisions, or in my naive 23, 24-year-old way that I was going to do that. I wanted to work on healthcare, and I wanted to do it through organizing. And so within a couple of weeks, I was in my car driving to Iowa to be an organizer for Howard Dean's presidential campaign. And Dean was the candidate at the time, as you may recall, who was really holding the Democrats' feet to the fire on the war. And as a former doctor and former governor of Vermont, he had achieved universal health care coverage in Vermont. So off I go to Iowa. I arrive, much to Howard Dean's dismay, still facial jewelry and all. You know, and this is back, I used to make homemade T-shirts, and so I arrived in one of my homemade T-shirts that said leftist in glitter. Like, didn't walk into the office, and I was there to organize Iowa farmers. So, with my, like, San Francisco uniform on, right? So,
say that again, left what?
Leftist.
Oh, leftist.
But it was in glitter. Yeah, in glitter, just to make it extra special. And so I arrive, and Howard Dean was like, what? You're going to organize the Iowa farmers? I was like, yes, I am. So off I did, and that's exactly what I did. And what I learned is when this, you know, girl coming from San Francisco with her facial jewelry, multicolored hair, and leftist shirts, sat down with these Iowa farmers who were salt of the earth folk, there was a lot that we shared in common. And when you sit down and actually really listen to people and try to understand where they're coming from, you will find that, right? They didn't like the war in Iraq. They wanted health care for their families. They wanted good public schools, all those things. And I think this is an important thing to remember, especially in the current politics that we're in. And I know it sounds crazy, but I still believe that fundamentally for most working folks, there's more that unites us than divides us, you know? And I think our elected officials need to do a lot more listening. You know, they need to do a lot more listening, understanding where people are coming from, and try to figure out where do we have the overlap in the Venn diagram where we can agree and build from there, you know? Especially in California, because we do have strong Democratic leadership. How do we move California forward on a progressive agenda, right? So I take those lessons with me, and I took that lesson with me to every campaign I did. After the Dean campaign, Dean screamed, as you may recall. I was in the room for the scream speech. I didn't realize I was witnessing history, but I was. So he was out, and I then joined the labor movement. And I worked for the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, fighting for better health care and better wages for Walmart workers. Walmart, who disproportionately hires women of color, treats them pretty terribly, doesn't provide health care, doesn't provide good wages. So that was very much a David and Goliath campaign, one of the most profitable companies in the world, and yet does not provide good benefits for their workers, drives out small businesses. There's a bunch that Walmart does. But that campaign wasn't just about Walmart, but it was about the unchecked corporate power that exists in our society. And I think you see this particularly in our campaign finance laws. And the fact that Chevron can write a $100 million check, should they so desire, to support anyone that they want, to me is not what our forefathers had intended, right? So I'm a big supporter of transparency around money in politics. I am one of few candidates across this state, this election cycle, who has chosen to not take a single penny of corporate money in my race. So if you look at my campaign finance laws, not one penny. But I think that's important. I want to go to Sacramento and be beholden only to the residents of 8015 and not the corporate interests, right? We have too much corporate money in politics. That's one of the issues I want to work on if I get there. So that effort then led me to be one of the early hires on an upstart campaign for a guy named Barack Hussein Obama. And I moved to Chicago in March of 2007, and I was employee number 32 for his campaign. And when I got there, we were, 30 points down in the polls. Hillary was definitely going to be the nominee, right? I don't know if you remember the early days of the Obama world, right? But when I got there, I had all these dreams of like, okay, we're going to elect the first black president, who came to us from Hawaii via Indonesia with a middle name Hussein. So it was a real sure bet, right? But when I got there, they said, we're so excited you're here. Turn around, you're moving back home to California to be the field director for Senator Obama. So I came back home. I was the field director here for Senator Obama. And I was working alongside a guy named Marshall Gans. And Marshall teaches social movement organizing at Harvard. And he had worked for Cesar Chavez for about 16 years in the migrant farm workers movement. And together, he and I developed the president's community organizing model. And that was one of the things that I contributed to the Obama campaigns. And that ended up being the model we used in the 2008 general election in every battleground state and in the 2012 general election. And when we won in 2008, the president took me with him to the White House. So off to DC I went, and I had the very distinct and humbling privilege and honor to serve the President of the United States. I was the Deputy Director of the White House Office of Public Engagement, working for Valerie Jarrett. And my job was basically to build support amongst the progressive community across the country for the President's legislative agenda. So I worked on a number of things. I helped get student loan reform done. I worked on Justice Sotomayor, the first Latina Supreme Court justice's confirmation. I worked on the early stages of the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But what I spent the majority of my time doing was working on the Affordable Care Act, which for me was very full circle in terms of the trajectory of my career. And there were a lot of ups and downs on that bill, a lot of fits and starts, as you may recall. Senator Kennedy had passed away in the middle of it. And while it's not a perfect law, it did move the needle considerably for folks. I will say it was a very sweet victory, and one that I will never forget, sitting in the Roosevelt Room with President Obama and Vice President Biden and the senior leadership team on a Sunday night in March of 2010, and we were watching C-SPAN and watching the votes come in on the Affordable Care Act. And I remember when the last vote came in and we had passed the ACA, the president jumps up out of his chair and he goes like this, and everyone's just like so excited and screaming and hugging. And the magnitude of the moment, I remember kind of stepping back and looking at this sort of sea of celebration. And the magnitude of the moment really hit me there. And I realized a couple things. One, I realized that I was at the table. And I had been a part of the change that I wanted to see. And it's so rare in politics when you actually get to do that. Because it's hard, and it's muddy, and it's mucky, And I sort of have a love-hate relationship with politics because of that, right? But I had been a part of the change I wanted to see. And the second thing I realized was that my friend would no longer be considered a pre-existing condition. And he was going to get the health care that is his right, along with 20 million other Americans. And that our public policies have an impact on people's lives. And it's easy to forget that as well, right? We're not just talking about theories here. This has an impact on people's lives. And the third thing I realized is that we do actually have the ability to pass progressive public policy that helps people. And that is fundamentally why I'm running for this seat. Because I think now more than ever we need people who are stepping into the arena. And the arena, I can assure you, is not always a fun place to be. But are stepping into the arena, fighting for a bold progressive vision that, in my opinion, is what Bruce and Sherry Wicks taught me when I was a little girl. That we are brothers and our sisters' keepers. And we need to create equitable social safety nets that allow all children good public schools, right? And all of our kids to breathe clean air and drink clean water. And for all of us to have safe, quality public transportation and affordable housing and all of the things that we so care for, right? That's what we're really fighting for. And now more than ever, we have to fight for this. Look at our politics. Look at what you all just said, the challenges that our communities are facing. I think right now we are in a critical moment in our nation's history that 10, 20, 30 years from now, we're going to look back on this moment and say, what did you do then? And that's why I'm running for this seat. Because I want to be able to look my daughter in the eye and say, I fought as hard as I could for all of these things that I know that we all care about. And when November 8th, 2016 happened, that was the day that Donald Trump was elected president, right? I remember where I was when that happened. I was actually I was actually 40 weeks pregnant. It was my due date. And I was pregnant with my daughter. And I had, as any pregnant woman who's given birth has visions of what their labor is going to look like. Mine was that CNN would be on in the delivery room, and we'd break the last glass ceiling. Hillary would be elected, and then my daughter would be born, and the future would be female. That's what I was planning for. So obviously none of that happened, and she actually came 2 weeks and 2 days late after a 3-day induced labor that ended in a cesarean, which I refer to as her first act of civil disobedience, right? She saw what was going on electorally. Yeah. She's like, you guys keep Trump's America. I'm going to be in a womb protected from this. But I remember sitting on my couch, and the moment that I really realized, after many minutes of denial, that Trump would be our president. The man who openly ran on a racist and misogynist agenda was going to be our president. And, I had worked for President Obama for 6 years, and it was so hard for me to, I'd worked in that building, it was so hard for me to imagine what that was going to be like. I mean, did any of us, could we really imagine it, And every day continues to be the horror story, that the worst case scenario that we had feared. But I remember the feeling I had in my gut was the same feeling I had in my gut when I was sitting in my car with my friend. That feeling of helplessness and anger and frustration, right? But then I remembered from sitting in my car with my friend vowing to work on healthcare to sitting in the Roosevelt room with President Obama was almost 7 years to the day. And in that sense, I actually have hope, because I think about what President Obama used to say, and he got this from Martin Luther King, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I actually think we are awakening in a new kind of way in this country. And that is my hope, right? And I have hope because since November 8th, 2016, record numbers of women who've never run before are stepping into the arena to run. I'm one of them. I'm a first-time candidate. And I got to say, I love the gentlemen that are here, but we need more women in office. We need more women in positions of leadership across the board, right? And especially in Sacramento. Sacramento right now, there are 120 legislators. We're in a 20-year low of women representation in Sacramento, 22%, lower than the national average, progressive California. And of the 120 legislators, there are only 6 women who are moms of young children. So when we talk about early childhood, paid leave policies, all these things, these social safety nets, I don't think that voice is being represented in the way that it needs to be in Sacramento. So that's another one of the reasons why I'm running for this seat. But I have hope also because you look at what is happening across this country with the Women's March and the activism that we're seeing. And these kids in Parkland, Florida, who are teaching us adults a thing or two about how to hold our elected officials' feet to the fire. And you look at what's happened in some of the elections that's happened. In Virginia, they have their state elections in 2017. So they had all their House races then at the state level. And Gabby Gifford's PAC, my husband runs Gabby Gifford's PAC. He does gun violence prevention work, and he and I met trying to pass the Manchin Toomey universal background checks bill in D.C. We didn't pass the bill, but we found each other and got married and got a baby, had a baby. So some good stuff came out of it, right? But Gabby's PAC supported 11 down-ballot candidates who went up against 11 NRA-backed candidates. And we won 11 out of 11 seats in Virginia on the gun issue. And I have hope because for me, this is my 177th or something house party on this campaign. And the fact that you all are sitting here on a Friday evening listening to a candidate in a down ballot race gives me hope because it shows me that you care about your community and you care about your state and you care about your country. So let me talk just briefly about some of the issues that you touched on education. And we have some retired teacher here, 2 current educators. You've mentioned a lot of the issues that we have, right? California right now is ranked 47th out of 50th in standard of living for children. 47th, that's Pew Research that looks at education, health, and nutrition, 47th out of 50th. Our 3rd grade math and reading scores are 43rd in the nation. 1 in 4 children in California go hungry every day. In California, 1 in 4 kids go hungry here. Right? Our per pupil spending is either 41st or 46th, depending on which survey you read. Right? That's how much we're investing in public education. And we are the 5th largest economy in the world with the highest concentration of billionaires and millionaires. So that doesn't seem fair to me. And the saddest part of the reality here is that there are major racial inequities in our public education system. And if you live in a wealthy community which tends to be white, you have better access to schools. If you live in a poor community which tends to be communities of color, you do not have that same access, right? And there is a school to prison pipeline that exists that we need to fundamentally address, and we have to put race in the middle of this conversation and figure out why do we have these inequities, you know? So what do we do about all of this? A couple things. I have a lot of ideas on it. I'm sure you all do too. But first and foremost, we have to pay our teachers more. The starting salary at Oakland Unified is $46,000 a year. If you're a starting teacher and you want to buy a house and have a child, because that's a normal American dream, you cannot do it, basically, unless you are married to a VC or you're going to live in Stockton and commute every day, which a lot of teachers do. The New York Times did this mega commute. They're commuting like 4 hours a day, right? So we've got to pay our teachers more. We have to provide more professional development, more mentoring, more coaching. Teaching is a hard profession. I mean, you all know, right? And providing that professional development, that coaching, that mentoring really, really helps, especially for those teachers that are new to it. You know, so we've got to give our teachers the supports that they need. The second thing is I'm a big believer in supporting early childhood education. I mean, you touched on some of this stuff. 0 through 5 right now is sort of like Lord of the Flies. Good luck out there, people. You know, the average cost of childcare in the Bay Area average is $2,000 a month for one kid. That's crazy. We do not invest in early childhood, and we've got to start investing in it more. I think 0 through 5 should be brought into the K through 12 system, and it should be one entitlement program. The number one indicator on if you're going to end up in the criminal justice system is how many words you speak by the time you're in kindergarten. So at kindergarten, some kids are here and some kids are here. And guess what? The kids that are down here tend to be kids of color because they haven't had the same access to quality education and quality care. So we have to fundamentally address those things as well. The third thing is we need more accountability for our charter schools. And I do believe there are charter schools that are doing good work, but we've got to bring more accountability and transparency around our charter schools. This is taxpayer money and needs to be analyzed and accounted for as such, right? And we've got to get rid of for-profit charters. We have to make it easier to identify poor-performing charters. I also believe charter teachers should be unionized and should have the ability to collectively bargain should they so choose. So there's a number of things I think we need to do there with the charters as well. The last thing I'll say on education, and I've got other ideas as well, but actually, sorry, 2 more things. One, the social and emotional learning of kids. So Massachusetts has the best public education system in the country. And what they realized is there was still a real persistent achievement gap, right, that they were noticing. And after they did some research, they realized that kids that are living in poverty and experiencing trauma, they bring that with them into the classroom, as any teacher knows, right? And you can have the best math teacher in the world, but if you're a kid who saw your mom get beat last night or you saw gun violence on the way to school, you're going to bring that into the classroom with you. So we need school therapists. We need school nurses. We need libraries open longer. Schools need to be the hub of the community. You know, that type of stuff is really important. And this is the stuff that gets cut right away when the budget takes a hit, right? So we've got to support those things. The last thing I'll say on education is higher ed. So in 1960, we had developed the master plan. And the vision of that was that anyone who wants to be able to go to college should be able to do it for free. Well, we've way ratcheted back that vision, right? UC Berkeley, our premier state institution in this district, guess how much it gets from the state every year for its budget? 10%. It is almost a private institution. So we've got to invest more in higher ed. I'm also a big believer in community colleges, as I'm alumni of one. And I believe that everyone who wants a 4-year degree should be able to get one, but not everyone wants or needs one. And we should have strong vocational programs at the community college level, especially if you're someone you don't have a college degree, you're 32, you have 2 kids. You're not going to move into the dorms for 4 years to get your degree, right? You know, it's like my mom. She wasn't able to do that, right? So if we have strong vocational programs that also don't cost people $150,000, right? And for jobs that are going to stay in the United States, in the care industry, in the building trades, you know, in the renewable energy sector, those are things we should have at the community college level. So the question is, how do we pay for all of that? That was a lot. That's a lot, right? I could just get up here and say it's all free, but it's got to come from somewhere. So a couple things. One, I'm a believer in closing the commercial loophole on Prop 13. And I'm not talking about the residential side. I'm talking about the commercial side. So Chevron Refinery, Transamerica, Disney Corporation, the wineries, the golf courses. In any other state, they pay 2018 taxes. In California, they pay 1978 taxes. If we close that commercial loophole, $11.4 billion could go into our state budget that can pay for all of those things that I just said. Right? So I think we've got to do that. It's going to be on the ballot in 2020. I support it. It also has a small business carve-out, which I think is important because small businesses have a hard enough time competing in an Amazon.com world. But to me, this is very critical because we've got to figure out more funding for our schools. The other thing that we can do, fun fact, since the early 80s, we've had a 500% increase in corrections spending because we wanted to incarcerate our way to safety. It turns out that doesn't work and it destroys families and communities. Right? We have built one new UC campus and 22 new prisons. So we need sentencing reform. We've got to figure this out. Instead of having a school-to-prison pipeline, we need a prison-to-school pipeline, right? And support adult education and a runway for folks coming out of prison so that they can get back into society and be active, productive members of society, right? And a reallocation of our resources, investing on the front end, investing in early childhood and K through 12 as opposed to prisons. This seems like an obvious thing to me, right? I want to move on education, talk quickly about housing, and then I'm happy to take any questions that you all have. On the housing issue, so, you know, as someone, I grew up in a trailer, and I dreamt of a wooden house. That was like a dream of mine, which sounds kind of like a funny dream, but when you grow up in a trailer and you're embarrassed to invite your friends over, that's like a real thing, you know? And I was a renter for 20 years. And I was evicted from my apartment when I was in my 20s because it got flipped to high-priced condos that I was not going to be able to afford. And my husband and I bought our first house a couple years ago in Oakland. And I know what it's like to buy in this market, you know? And it was a big deal for us to buy our first house. It's very difficult. If you want just a decent house, nothing fancy, in a safe neighborhood, with a good school district, near a BART stop because you got to go to San Francisco every day, you cannot do it. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do. And so what has happened over the last couple of decades is we've had a huge increase and influx of high-paying jobs in the region, which are good. We like high-paying jobs, right? You want those in your communities. But we haven't built up enough housing to keep up with that. So we've had a supply and demand challenge, right? So like if you look at the peninsula, Apple built their massive $5 billion spaceship headquarters made of glass. And they were required by local law to have 11,000 parking spots. Guess how much housing was required? Zero. And Atherton's like, we like our half-acre parcels. We're good. No need to build here, right? And so then where are these folks going to go with their $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and up salaries? They're going to go up the peninsula, into the South Bay, into the East Bay, get on their buses every morning, be shuttled to work. Google and Facebook and others are now shuttling people from Sacramento. They're getting on the buses from Sacramento, going to the peninsula, because people can't afford here anymore, right? They're in these buses now for like, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours a day. So what do we do? How do we fix this problem? Those folks are, with their salaries, are competing with our dishwashers, our teachers, our nurses, right? We have a lot of folks that are teachers, nurses, cops, firefighters, living, I don't know, an hour east, hour and a half east, commuting here every day to work in the communities in which they're serving. So here's what I think we need to do. We need to build more transit-oriented housing. We need to be building more around our BART stops. We've invested billions of dollars into our public BART system. We need to invest more. But we've got to, I think, build more around our BART stops, right? Create more dense, walkable communities. You know, and you basically have 3 options on the housing challenge. You can do nothing and continue to lose our low-income communities, our communities of color, you know, make our teachers and nurses drive 2 hours each way to work here. You can build out towards Stockton. You know, here we go, track homes, traffic jams. And by the way, I think you mentioned environment. One of you guys did. 39% of our greenhouse gas comes out of our exhaust pipes, right? Or we can build more dense, walkable communities and invest in our public transportation. So I'm a big supporter of that. We also have to do everything we can to guard against displacement. And by the way, when I say build, I mean low-income subsidized housing, but also middle income for the missing middle who don't qualify for that, and market rate housing, right? As well as workforce development housing. I support workforce development housing. I did a tour of a middle school in Oakland recently, and they've done a really good job of turning the school around. And I said, what's your biggest problem? And the principal said to me, I'm at like 25% vacancy because I can't hire any teachers because they can't afford to live here, you know, because they can't afford the cost of housing. If we had workforce development housing for those teachers, then that would be less of an issue, right? We also have to do everything we can to guard against displacement, and the rent control question comes up a lot, right? And I think there are ways we can find rent control that that protects renters that need it, and other mechanisms. I'm a supporter of increasing the renter tax credit. Right now it's $60 a year. Homeowners get a lot of tax incentives to own a home. Renters do not. And 3/4 of Californians are one $700 emergency away of going into poverty. So if we could increase the renter tax credit significantly, tenfold or so, or create a rental assistance fund that could be used if someone, they lose their job, their car breaks down, they can't afford rent, they're not going to be kicked out and be homeless, right? Some kind of a cushion there to prevent the homelessness before it happens. I think we have to figure that out. The other thing I'll say is there's been a lot of good work with giving legal recourse and having a legal defense fund for renters who are facing unfair evictions. When you level the playing field and give renters a little bit more, empower them more legally, it reduces eviction significantly. So there's a suite of things that I think we need to do there that I think are important. I also support things like really incentivizing ADUs, accessory dwelling units, as a way to create more density in neighborhoods. And the challenge with ADUs is a lot of people have a detached garage or a place they could make an apartment, but they don't have $200,000 lying around, because who has $200,000 lying around? Most people don't, right? But if we had a California Public Infrastructure Bank that could give a really good low rate, interest rate for someone to do that, if they housed a low-income person at their place for a certain number of years, then you make it a win-win-win, right? So we need to do things like that and be creative about how we're solving the housing crisis. There's also a lot I have ideas around on homelessness, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A that I think that we need to do. But let me just wrap up so you all can ask questions if you have it. Just a little bit about the race and the district. So the district spans from, on the southern border, it's sort of the northern part of Oakland, Temescal, over by the Kaiser, Mosswood neighborhood, over to Piedmont and Montclair, and then goes all the way to Hercules and Pinole. So northern Oakland, all of Berkeley, Emeryville, El Cerrito, Kensington, San Pablo, Richmond, Hercules, Pinole, that whole region. It's almost 500,000 people. I got into this race Memorial Day weekend of last year, so it's been a lovely, long journey. I'm hopefully going to survive the longest job application process in the history of humanity. We had a 12-way primary. I placed first in the primary with about 31% of the vote, and my opponent had about 15% of the vote, so I did pretty well in the primary. But it was in part because we had about 161 house parties. We knocked on 35,000 doors in the last 6 weeks of the campaign with about 500 volunteers. I'm a big believer in grassroots organizing. And I was really lucky when I got into the race to be endorsed by U.S. Senator Kamala Harris, who I've worked with over the years. Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom, who's going to be our next governor, has endorsed me, and he's going to be in town doing a campaign event for me next Thursday, if you want to come by our office in Berkeley. And we're also opening up an office in Emeryville, El Cerrito this weekend. So we'd love for you all to go there. I've received the majority of the mayors in the district have endorsed me. In West Contra Costa County in particular, Tom Butt, Myrna De Vera, who's no longer the mayor, but she's still in the city council. Chris Kelly has endorsed me. Gabe Quinto in El Cerrito has endorsed me. A lot of really good folks. Also in Richmond, Irma Anderson. Uche's endorsed me. Irma Anderson, Jim McMillan, a lot of really good leaders locally in the area, which has been great. And I have 13 labor unions that have come on to support my candidacy. Today, the UFCW announced they've endorsed me, which was great. Dolores Huerta just came on as an endorser, which is great. And I also have President Barack Obama, my old boss, that guy, Gabby Giffords, a bunch of really great, awesome leaders. But what I'm most proud of is the community organizing work that we've done on the campaign. And I truly believe that the only way that we make change in this country is from the bottom up. It's how we elected our first black president. It's how women got the right to vote. It's how we got the 40-hour work week, right? So I'm a big believer in it. I'm a big believer in physically, literally being in people's living rooms, and if I get this job, I will continue to do house parties as a sitting state legislator. I don't know if other legislators do that or not, but I find it to be very, very valuable. So I am off to the races. We are 61 days from Election Day. I need all the help I can get. What that means is if you want to write me a check, I will take your money. I got a lot of money to raise. These things are expensive. I'm not taking any corporate money. So I got to make up for it elsewhere. So I will gladly take resources. If you want to host me in your living room, I will show up. If you want to knock on doors, we're door knocking all over the place. If you want to knock on your neighbor's door, we will get you that turf. If you don't want to talk to your neighbors about politics, we can get you at someone else's neighborhood so you don't have to talk to people you know. But I need all the help I can get, and most importantly, I love your vote. I need you to vote for me. I need your support. I need you to put a yard sign out. You know, there's a lot going on in this race. And I think that I am the candidate who can go to Sacramento and not just vote the right way, but I can fight the right way, and I can lead the right way. And I can go build the necessary coalitions to fix all these challenges that we have. We have to remember that we can fix this. Homelessness is not just something that it's just always going to be there. We can fix it. If we've put people on the moon, we can fix homelessness, right? So, but I need help getting there. So I really appreciate you all being here, and I'm happy to answer them.